Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Jones Doyle with the Tarrant County AgriLife Extension Office, and welcome to the Small Acreage Seminar, Session 2, Sheep and Goats. With us today, we have Dr. Reed Redden, who is our sheep and goat specialist at Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. Just to let everyone know, today we'd like this to be as interactive as possible. So if you've got any questions, please feel free to either post them in the chat box or to unmute yourselves and ask the questions throughout the presentation. This presentation is being recorded and will be posted to the Tarrant AgriLife YouTube page. Hopefully within the next week to 10 business days on that. After I get a little bit of recording, editing done to it. Once that is posted to the YouTube page, I will send out a link to everyone that has registered for the Small Acreage Seminar. With that being said, Reed, I will turn the presentation over to you.
All right. Well, thank you. I've been asked to kind of present on management and production of sheep and goats. And so I'll kind of go through some different things. And of course, if we were going to really try to get into the details, it would have to be a lot longer. So I'll just hit some highlights. I'd be glad to try to answer any questions or take any comments from the group and try to keep it as interactive as possible. You can do that by unmuting yourself and go ahead and ask a question or raise your hand or enter in the chat box, and we'll try to do the best we can to keep this interactive and you all get as much out of this as you're hoping to. So I'm a sheep and goat specialist. I'm housed in San Angelo, Texas at the research center here. And I serve as a sheep and goat specialist, but I also am a director or the center director here for this research station. And we do a lot of small ruminant and rangeland type research. So before we jump too deep into this, I like to use this figure, if you will, quite a bit, because I think a lot of people that are interested in getting into sheep and goats, or they have some, maybe don't always stop and look at what the grazing preferences or the grazing differences there are between cattle, sheep, and goats. And so I really like this figure. It comes out of a publication called "What Range Herbivores Eat and Why," and you can see the name and the authors at the bottom of the slide. But it kind of gives us a brief snapshot into what these animals prefer to eat. They don't eat like this all the time because throughout the year things change and different things are a better quality and they go seek them out. But as a general rule, cattle generally eat around 80% of their diet as grass. Sheep do eat the majority of their diet as grass, but they also eat a fair amount of forbs. Forbs would be what we generally think of as weeds, broadleaf type plants that they'll selectively go seek out. And they really like these plants because they can go through and selectively, they don't have to graze the whole plant. So there might be things in the plant they don't like, but they can, pick off a few leaves or the flowers or the fruits or whatever that's with it. And then browse is the leaves, shoots, and fruits of woody plants. So things like cedar trees, they don't eat a lot of that. Goats eat more cedar than sheep do, but there's other palatable browse species in the state. And then that varies by region, but they'll eat that at around 20% of their diet. And then a goat eats probably the least amount of grass of the three livestock species presented here, and eats about an equal amount of browse. And so generally people always say goats are curious and they'll eat anything, even an aluminum can. That's not really true. They may be curious, but they're very selective about their diet, and they like a lot more diversity in it than cattle or sheep do. And so that presents some strengths and some weaknesses. So, if we have an improved pasture with a lot of grass where there's not as much browse or forbs, Goats may not be able to perform as well as sheep or cows would in that scenario. But if we have some pastures and we have a fair amount of brush species, then goats are really going to complement other livestock species or do well as a single species unit in that, compared to, say, beef cattle. So the second thing I think is really important when we're running sheep and goats, if we're new to it or we've kind of been in it a while, is making sure that we get a sustainable stocking rate. And that's if we're trying to, capitalize or optimize the amount of animals that we run on an acre or however many acres that you have, and to where the animals are taking care of the land and you're getting the most from it. Obviously there's places where it's more of a dry lot scenario, and I'm sorry, excuse me. Where we're buying in hay and feeding a lot of feed, and we're not trying to optimize the system for a forage production off the grass. But if you are, it's important that we get the right number of animals on there. Of course, year in, year out, it's going to rain more or less, and we're going to have different environmental conditions that changes what exactly grows and what they can utilize. But getting a pretty close estimate and getting stocked at the right rate really helps. So just as an example, let's say that a place has 50 acres and we want to run, sheep, goats, and or cows on it. So, every region of the state is going to be different what the kind of base stocking rate is. So just for simple math, in your region, it's probably lower than this. So it might be, say 15 acres per animal unit. And that'll vary depending on the land types. But just for simple math, if you need 25 acres per animal unit, that means that you could run, essentially 2 cows or 2 beef species. Most of the time we're raising offspring. So 1 cow and 1 bull, or potentially the bull's only there for, say half the year. And so we're not real efficient with having, a higher rate of females to males and optimize the land that we have to produce as much as we could. If we're going to run sheep, that's going to vary. This chart over here is out of another publication that's available online. It's called Livestock for Small Acreage Landowners. And it kind of gives a number of head per animal unit. So an animal unit would be a 1,000-pound cow. And so if we're running hair sheep, in this example, it's an 80-pound ewe, we can run 8 ewes per cow. So in that scenario, we could run 2 animal units on the 50 acres. And then if you did 2 times 8, you get 16. So we could run 15 hair ewes if they're in the neighborhood of 80 pounds and 1 ram. Now, if those sheep weigh 150 pounds, then that's definitely going to be a different number. We're going to have to adjust our animal unit. If we're running a meat goat herd, so if you go down here, so goats, a doe, 100-pound doe, we would run 7 does per animal unit. So if we're running 2 animal units, we take 7 times 2, give us 14. So we essentially could run 13 does and 1 buck. And this number can move around a little bit, but I guess the example is oftentimes someone will have 50 acres and then they'll have 50 sheep or goats. And then, then the next thing you know, in a couple of years, it's kind of a rock pile. We can't grow a lot of grass. There's a lot of weeds that grow that the sheep and goats don't eat, and it becomes into an unsustainable system. So just wanted to kind of start with those two concepts. So the rest of this presentation, I'll kind of start with a market outlook. I think it's important if we're raising some of these animals, we have a general idea of what the markets do look like and where they're going, and then jump into some of the general management stuff. What type of fences we need, how to kind of set up a nutrition program that sets you up for success. What parasites are major concerns and how we can do our best to mitigate those issues. And then also what predators are problematic and how to go about trying to protect your animals from those predators. And then I'll try to wrap up with some different livestock options within sheep and goats, the different breeds and breed types. And they vary quite a bit, and it changes your management quite a bit depending on the type of breed or breed types that you use. So jumping into the markets, we do some market reports that we host on our website here in San Angelo. It's called, or the website address is sanangelo.tamu.edu. And there's on the front page, there's, auction reports, and you can click on them and navigate through a number of different reports. But this is one of my favorites just because it gives you a good snapshot of where we've been and potentially where we're going. So the dotted line is 2016 to 2020, and it's the average price of kind of the average weight lamb sold at the San Angelo auction, which is one of the biggest sheep and goat auctions in the state. So it's pretty representative of what's going on, across the state and nation in reality. And then it's broken down by month. We see the best markets for sheep and goats in the winter months when our supply is the lowest. And then as supply increases through the spring and into the summer, the market drops down. So, prior to COVID, the market was good, but it wasn't phenomenal. Post COVID, it's just really taken off. So the blue line is 2021, and you can see that it's essentially close to above 50% above the years before, the average years before. And actually 20 is not up here, and 20 was even higher than the years before that. And so that probably brought this dotted line up a little bit. So kind of the same trends, the low markets in the summer, but we're at a much higher level. And then now here in 2022, at the beginning of the year, just record prices for lambs. The average weight of a lamb sold is around 60 pounds. Here in San Angelo. And so it's been falling just because of increases in supply. And it's the time of year that it generally starts trending down anyways, but it's still extremely high given the historical averages. The meat goat market has kind of follows a similar trend that the highest markets are in the winter. The goats tend to show up later in the year. They're more seasonal. And so the supply picks up more in the summer and less in the spring. And so that market holds longer throughout the year. And that was no different in 2021. And then we're kind of on that same trend in 2022. But, $4 a pound is just incredible prices for these animals, driven largely due to just a lack of supply and a growing demand in the United States. So I put this slide in here. It's actually dated a bit. It says 2021 West Central Texas livestock budgets. We used to have an economist here. We're in the process of rehiring one. But what they would do is put together annual budgets and projected gross returns by livestock species that included all of the common factors that were out there. And then it kind of plotted them by these livestock species adjusted to an animal unit basis. And the economics there clearly indicated that meat goats were one of the highest value livestock commodities in our region. But this doesn't include the market changes post-COVID. So the hair sheep market has significantly improved. The meat goats has hung on. The wool sheep's improved. Fortunately, the cow-calf hasn't improved as much as these others through the COVID period. So that's just a little general over the markets. Fencing is one of the biggest challenges why people don't run sheep and goats. They may not just have the adequate fences to run them. And so what do you really need, or what is best? Generally, what's best is a woven wire fence. So fence quality is pretty important, especially with goats. They're very curious animals and will try to escape just from a curiosity standpoint. Most of these fences, they vary, but as a general rule, they come in 4, 6, and 12-inch spacings. And it's important on the spacings for the type of livestock species that you're going to run. And the reason I say that is 4 inches or less does a really good job of keeping the animals in, the predators out, and it keeps the goats from sticking their head through the fence. If you get into that 6-inch spacing, the goats can get their heads through, but unfortunately their horns will hang up and they can't get back out. And so you could go up to 12-inch facings and they can get their head through and back, but it might not stop some of our predator species as well as we'd like it. Most people are generally putting a barbed wire on the top and bottom of these fences. When I was a younger growing up, everyone had like the 36-inch net fence and then 2 barbs across the top. Most people have gone away from that because so many deer get their legs hung up in those 2 top bottom wires. But having that barbed wire at the top and the bottom keeps things from digging under it, as well as things from trying to go over the top of it and rubbing on it if we were to run cows or horses or something like that. We can get by with electric or barbed wire, but it's not quite as secure, and they take a little bit more maintenance, especially if we're running electric. And it depends on how many of these strands that you're running. 3-strand electric is pretty common, but it's a temporary type fence where we're just fencing in maybe a field and we're grazing some sheep and goats on it after it's been harvested or something. As we move up to 5 and 7 strands, those tend to be fairly sufficient for sheep. But sometimes we may even need to go higher to keep goats in. When we start putting up, 7 to 9 strands of barbed wire, we may be at the same cost as a woven wire fence. And so you need to just kind of put those into consideration. And you can do a combination where you have, some barb and a couple of offsets of electric to help discourage animals from going through it, or even adding some electric to woven wire fence to keep animals from pushing through it. But it's important that we have the right type of fence. From a nutrition standpoint, nutrition is the key to animal health and productivity. So well-fed animals will perform and do well when we raise large lamb and kid crops, and we don't have near as much health issues if they're well-fed. But nutrition is fairly complicated. If you're trying to, really do this with a detail-oriented nature and try and design the perfect feeds for them, you're going to need to work with a nutritionist because it's pretty complicated to get it all down to an exact science. Most people that are running sheep and goats, they keep it simple. Philosophy is what they apply. Where the majority of their feed is coming either from the pasture or supplemental hay. And then as that pasture or hay quality is not maintaining the animal's body condition, so they're losing weight, and then they're going to add in some level of supplement, a little bit of corn, a pelleted feed of some type. Some people may also use the molasses lick tubs for protein, maybe mineral, a little extra sugar, things that help them maintain that body condition or stop body condition loss, depending on what stage of production we're in. And then ensuring that the animals have some salt and a mineral packet that's fit for whatever type of feed system they are. And, not to get into too much of the details on minerals, I'd encourage you to talk with a nutritionist or a mineral supplier and ask quite a bit of questions. Is that mineral designed for your animals? If you're in a confined feeding system where you're feeding a lot of grains, that's going to be different than a mineral that you're going to have out on pasture. And then if you're running on farmed fields, the minerals that they need depends on what's in the soil and what's been applied to that soil over the years. And so it generally is not evident until there's been a long history of deficiencies with mineral, but it's something to keep on our mind. One thing I don't have on here is water. Water quality is pretty important for sheep and goats. They're not animals that like a lot of water. They don't like to go stand in water, but they do like clean, fresh water to drink. And if we don't have that clean, fresh water, it's going to have an impact on their production, or some of them are going to be impacted by production because they're not drinking enough water. So, to do this, as I mentioned before, really focus on that body condition. The sheep in the picture here are all, I think these are all ram lambs that are very well conditioned. They're probably in that 3.5 body condition range. And so that's about ideal. If we start putting on more condition than that, then they're probably a little overweight. And then if we stop dropping below this body condition 3 or less, depending on the stage of production, if they're a young growing animal, that's not good. Or if they're a gestating or lactating ewe or doe, that's generally not that good as well. There's several body condition guides out there. You can just do a quick Google search and it'll kind of detail what you're looking for in the animals, how you feel down their backbone and their ribs to quantify these different body condition score targets. But most people who have been around livestock find that fairly easy to navigate through. Predators is a big concern for sheep and goats. I mean, this is one of the reasons that Texas doesn't raise near the number of sheep and goats that it used to. Is there's just so many more predators out there, and especially the big operations on large landscapes. It's just very challenging to manage the predators. Smaller acreage programs have the benefit to be able to see their animals. They generally have better fencing. Guardian animals tend to be better on smaller acreage places, and so there's a better chance of success there against predators than some of our large pasture systems. The predators that we're most concerned about, coyote is the number one predator of sheep and goats. That's pretty universal across the United States, as is the second most common predator is domestic dog. So, it could be the farmer or rancher's own dog, our own dogs that get off the leash and cause problems, or the neighbor's dogs. Or generally we don't really have feral dogs. It's generally somebody's dog that causes a problem. I view feral pigs as probably the third biggest problem. Unfortunately, we don't have good survey data on this. And one of the challenges is feral pigs eat everything. So if they come in and start eating lambs and kids, you don't find much of anything. And so quantifying it is a problem. Bobcats can be a problem, depending on what region you are. Mountain lions, it's pretty sporadic. It doesn't happen very often, but when it does, they can take large groups of animals at one time, and it can be pretty ugly. Eagles, the Mexican eagle or caracara is pretty damaging. It comes through, catches those young lambs or kid goats and kind of pecks their eyes out. And then after they die, they'll come in and eat them. Black-headed buzzards do the same thing. These can be a real challenge because they're federally protected migratory birds. And so we can't shoot them without a permit. We need to work with wildlife services. Red fox is really uncommon in our region. It may be more common in your area. Probably not a huge issue. They're really only going to target brand new lambs and kids. And then there's a whole host of other things that could be a problem, like raccoons or skunks or those type of stuff. So, but they're generally pretty manageable. So, there's kind of a three-prong approach for predators. The first is probably most effective is having good fences. If you can completely fence out most of the ground predators, that really helps. With good fences and maybe dry lots where we can pin them, we can stop most of our predators. And then guardian animals, thereafter, livestock guardian dogs can be very effective, but they're also really high management in certain instances. So some people do prefer to use donkeys or llamas. They're a little easier to use, and then smaller acreage systems tend to be pretty effective. And then whenever, the fences and or guard animals, fail in lethal removal, if possible, is a needed approach in some situations. But if you can kind of apply all three of those, you generally can get a pretty good handle on predation. Internal parasites is a big issue. It's not been an issue in our area this year because of the drought. But we do tend to struggle with internal parasites when we have rainier years. Our annual rainfall here in San Angelo is about 20 inches. When you get into environments that you have 30 plus inches of rain a year and you're in a warm environment where you're above 85 degrees for a good chunk of the year, we see a lot of internal parasite problems in grass-based systems. If they're in a complete dry lot, It's not as big of an issue, but in grass-based systems, it can. There's one worm in particular. The scientific name is Hymonchus contortus. It's also called the barber pole worm. And the reason that it is so damaging is it's a blood feeder, and it's a very prolific blood feeder. So here's a picture of it in the bottom right corner. It's got an appendage that looks like a hypodermic needle on the front of it, and it lives in the abomasum and just slices the lining of the abomasum to where the animals just essentially bleed internally, and then this worm feeds on that blood. If you get too many of them, they can cause enough hemorrhaging within inside that the animals just run out of red blood cells to carry oxygen. So they get anemic, they get lethargic, and in some cases, left untreated, they will die. So that one's pretty damaging. We got to stay on top of it. There's a whole host of strategies to go about it, and I can try to answer some questions that the group has, but it would take us several hours to get through really understanding the life cycle, really understanding integrated parasite management. We really need to think about controlling it in ways that's not just deworming. Deworming is definitely a tool that we need to strategically use, but we can't rely on deworming alone, or anthelmintic resistance by the parasites themselves will occur, and we're likely to have some problems. The other parasite is Coccidia that leads to coccidiosis. It generally affects young lambs and kid goats that are stressed, and generally stress occurs right around the weaning time. And so it's a protozoa. It's actually not a parasite in my mind, but I guess it kind of is. But it's a single-celled organism. They will develop immunity to it and be protected for the rest of their life. But when they're young and they haven't developed that immunity yet, it can cause bloody diarrhea, really nasty lower digestive tract issues, and some animals will die of it if not treated, or if there's not some type of prevention that's going on. If they're good and healthy and growing, and we keep a low stress environment, you may never see this. But when that stress does come on, this time of year is whenever we would start seeing that. It's really hot and dry. We run out of feed in the pasture, and we start weaning those animals and bring them into a confined area. They're stressed out. We're changing their different feeds. And then this coccidia kind of just persists in the digestive tract. And then when it sees this opportunity, it proliferates and causes some pretty nasty issues. Kind of as I mentioned before, some good control techniques is maintaining good body condition. Healthy animals are going to do a good job of fighting this off on their own. Strategic supplementation. So, lactating ewes, young growing lambs, and kid goats, lactating does, they need the right feed, or they'll start not have enough protein in their diet to fuel their immune system. Pasture rotation helps, so that we're trying to break that life cycle, but it needs to be pretty strategic in pasture rotation, because this worm is, especially Hymonchus, is pretty tough to rotate out of, because it can hatch within about 4 days and it can live for months and months on the pasture. And so, rotating once every 4 or 5 months is probably not going to do it altogether, but it may help some. Genetic selection is another good component, finding animals that are able to thrive in this, even though they're challenged by it. We have a parasite lab here at the research center where people can subsample their entire land or kid crops and just the fecal samples. We'll go through them and then identify which animals are maintaining lower fecal egg counts or maintaining lower levels of parasites than others, and using that in our genetic selection strategy, or taking that to the next step and generating estimated breeding values, which are kind of like EPDs in the beef industry for parasite resistance. This can be used very well. The Katahdin breed has probably been the leader in the United States using that technology. And they've really established themselves as a breed that performs well in high parasite regions. And then strategic deworming. We are going to need to treat animals to prevent animal welfare issues, but using that in a strategic manner. That may include using multiple products at the same time. It's likely to include only treating the animals that are anemic or needing it, and not treating everybody. So we maintain that what we call refugia, which is leaving some worms untreated within the animals, so that they replicate or reproduce at a low level, and keep those parasites that are naive to dewormers, so that we can be more effective with them in the future. I know I'm hitting a lot of stuff real quick. I can kind of stop right here and try to answer some questions before I jump into the next section of this presentation. So, small ruminant options and the kind of pros and cons of each. So, wool sheep in general, when I say wool sheep, there's a lot of different breeds that grow wool, hundreds, if not thousands of them around the world. The ones that are real common in Texas would be the Rambouillet on the bottom right. It's a fine wool producing breed, high quality wool. They're kind of a dual purpose breed. Their lambs are still seen quite well in value for the traditional side of the sheep industry. And then we have our wool sheep that we tend to see more at our county fairs and state fairs, which would be our medium wool breeds, our Suffolks, our Hamps. And then, a cross of the medium wool with the Rambouillet U gets our fine wool cross. Those are three of the major breed types in the show world, and we see a lot of youth exhibit those three, in addition to Southdown and Dorpers is becoming more and more popular. So the benefits from them is we can market both food and fiber. Unfortunately, the fiber is not near the value that it used to be. The fine wool type sheep, we can shear them and still make money off of them. The medium wool breeds, generally the wool value is off an animal is less than what it costs to shear it, and so we're not seeing that. We do see a lot of hobby, well, I shouldn't say hobby, niche craft wool breeds. This actually is a picture from Montana. Obviously, it's not Texas, but somebody developed their own wool mill, and these are coarse wool animals, but it was more for the hand spinning market. And so, there's real opportunity to market this to people that are wanting to get back into agriculture or connected back to agriculture. But, not on a large scale. You're going to have to do a lot of marketing to move that out. The negative for wool sheep is they tend to be more management. The breeds themselves require, shearing. We generally have to dock their tails, or we have the risk of fly strike. They tend to be a little bit larger framed animals, so they require a little bit more supplement. And so there's more management involved with our wool sheep. Hair sheep are kind of the most popular breed or breed types in Texas now. And because they're smaller framed animals, they're a little bit better suited to the environment without as much supplemental feed. And thus they require less management because we're not shearing them. In all practical purposes, there's not really a need to dock their tails. So we don't need to go through that process. Some people may decide if they want to castrate or not. Depending on the time of the year, we may see, benefits from not castrating. And then sometimes you may see some discounts from not having those animals castrated. And it depends on how big they're being marketed at, so on and so forth. The negative to our hair sheep breeds is there's fewer markets. The market that really prefers these type of breeds is the non-traditional market, but that is the biggest market in this region. So we're not really that limited in what they can be marketed into. Some of our native type breeds that don't require as much deworming, like the Barbados or the St. Croix, may not have as much meat to them. And so they may not be able to get the premiums that you would get with a Dorper or a Dorper cross type breed, but you may have less into them. So it's kind of up to the person what strategy they want to go about for the type of breed within the hair sheep breed types. Hair goats, so Angora goats. At one point in time, there was probably close to 10 million Angora goats in the state of Texas. And they were very popular. They're very well suited to the environment, and they were marketing a really high value fiber into the world. That went through a period where that mohair was not worth what it was 30, 40 years ago, and then the markets went way down and meat goats kind of took over. The value of mohair has gone back up, and it's probably as high as it's ever been. But so has the value of meat goats. And so we're actually not seeing a lot of people get back into raising Angoras, just because they're much more high management than some of our meat goat breeds would be. Benefits to them is their moderate browse use, so they're probably not going to eat as much brush as a meat goat or a Spanish boar cross would be, but they're going to eat more browse and have a more diverse grazing style than beef cattle would. You're producing both food and fiber, so dual marketability. And then the negatives to them would be, again, a high management. These animals require shearing twice a year. They're a little bit lower fertility. If you're able to raise 100% kid crop out of Angoras, you're doing really well, or slightly above that. Because of the selective breeding for hair production for so many years, they don't have quite as much of the growth and the fertility traits that some of our other breeds do. So the most common goat in Texas would be the meat goat, which is generally a cross between the Spanish goat, which is kind of our native landrace goat here, and the imported boar goat that came in the 90s. These goats are high browsers, so they eat a lot of browse. Their management is generally pretty low when we're running Spanish or Spanish boar crosses. The straight boars tend to be a bit more high management than the crosses or the landrace type breeds. But there's extremely strong markets. And I showed the graphs at the beginning, over $4 a pound on average for some of these kid goats going into the markets. And so exceptionally strong. And the Spanish boar crosses are pretty prolific. Some folks with really good management can raise, over 150% kid crop. State average, I believe, is around 105 for goats, and it's around 80% for sheep. And so they're more prolific than sheep, and with good management can be extremely high in their reproductive potential. The negatives to them is they tend to be more management than our hair sheep, and some of that is the type of fencing they need. They don't have the inherent resistance to parasites. They are more susceptible to internal parasites when they have to eat more grass. Now, when they're in a browse system and they're not eating a lot of grass off the ground, and they're eating browse and weeds more elevated off the ground where it breaks that parasite cycle, they may be pretty good at not needing a whole lot of treatment for parasites. And as I mentioned before, they require good fences. Dairy goats, there's a fair number of dairy goats in the state of Texas. Not near as many meat goats as there are, but there's probably as many dairy goats as there are Angoras. And these tend to be smaller acreage type situations. They've probably eaten most of the browse out of the place, so they're not running on large range type deals. Dual purpose, so we can market the kids, the male kids and the milk products into the market. They're pretty prolific, so raise a large kid crop from them. The negative is if we're running a dairy herd, they need to be milked at least once a day, so it's pretty high management. And there's not the creameries like you would see, in the beef cattle dairy world, or where we're just selling at bulk. Most of the time, you're going to have to direct market or create the soaps and the cheeses and the different things for there. So it can be a fun thing to do, but there's not a lot of larger commercial scale dairy operations in Texas, or at least in our region. So that kind of hits the high points of my presentation here. I see I'm about 40 minutes in. So I'm just going to talk to you about some other resources that we have online if you want to dig further into this. We have an online course called Sheep and Goat Ranching 101, which is kind of a self-guided course where you go through and it breaks it into the sheep and goat industry section by section, and you kind of test yourself throughout the process. And so I think it's $25, and you can go back to it as many times as you would like. We have a YouTube channel. It's pretty popular. We have, I think, close to 60 videos on here now, several thousand followers. This is a little old. This says 1.25, but there's over 2,000 followers now. And, it's kind of specific to the topic, but there's a whole bunch of different videos in there. If you have questions about, a disease or nutrition or reproductive management, there's probably a video in there that answers the question that you may have. If you'd like to just stay up to date on what's going on, we're really active on Facebook. I have a Facebook page with, I think, 25,000 followers, something like that. We post several times a week. Some of them are shares, some of them are individual things that we do that come direct from us. The handle is at Tamu Sheep and Goats. I'm not very active on Twitter, unfortunately. And then about half of the stuff we get on Facebook ends up on Instagram. I do write a monthly blog called Reed's Ramblings. You can sign up online, or if you're a member of Texas Sheep and Goat Raisers Association, you should get Ranching and Rural Living, and that's published in there as well. And then a program specialist of mine, Jake Thorne, does a podcast called the ASI Research Update, kind of new things happening in the industry, what research is going on, how that applies to the sheep industry. If you're a little old school and like the old fact sheets, there's a really good one called Livestock for Small Acreage Landowners. I think I referenced it earlier. There's the front cover of it. I encourage you to read that one. Although it may not be hot off the press, it's still very applicable. So with that, I'll kind of wrap up my portion of this, and I can take questions if you all have any.
Thanks, Reed. It's some really great information today. We'll go ahead and open it up for questions. Feel free to unmute yourself or place them in the chat box.
I have a question around parasite management in goats.
Sure, go ahead.
So I've heard some stuff around using copper, like making sure that they have adequate levels of copper is like really important for parasite management in goats. Is that true? Like, could you say anything on that?
Sure. Yeah, there's kind of two components there. Copper is a element that's needed by all livestock species. Excuse me. Sheep need about, if we're balancing a diet, where it's about 10 parts per million. Goats generally need something above 25 parts per million. And I'm kind of generalizing this, and it hasn't been, detailed. In cattle is probably above 50 parts per million. If sheep are fed a diet that's about 50 parts per million, over a period of time, they can accumulate copper and then develop toxicity to it. And so a lot of times our sheep and goat feeds don't have enough copper in them for what a goat may need. And so if you get a very goat specific product, it's going to have higher levels of copper. So that's one component. If they don't have enough copper and we have a copper deficiency, it might reduce their overall performance, doability, and the immune system. So they may not have enough copper because feed companies are so sensitive to litigation from too much copper if people don't use things right. And then the second thing is there's a product called copper oxide wire particles, and it comes in a bolus. And it's basically copper wire chopped up into little pieces. And so if we give that bolus to animals that have internal parasites, specifically Hymonchus, which is the worst one, when those wires hit the abomasum, it creates an environment that the parasites do not like, and it kills a good chunk of those. And then if we give that bolus and we give a dewormer with it at the same time, that bolus dewormer combination really improves the effectiveness of parasite control compared to giving them, by themselves. And so when dewormers were first put on the market, they were 99 to 100% effective. Now most of them range somewhere between 40 and 90% efficacy. And so, let's say something is only 50% effective. If we add a bolus back with it, we can take it back to that 95 to 98% efficacy. So kind of two things: copper for general health and well-being, and then copper to help with internal parasite control.
Okay.
Is that
Yeah,
helpful?
no, that really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. And we have a YouTube video on that. So if you look up copper oxide wire particle boluses and then just search Redden by my last name, and you can find it. It's about a 5 to 7 minute video on how to use that, when to use it. And there's a lot of good information. Wormx.info, write out worm, the letter X.info is a great website for internal parasite management, and have a lot of information about copper oxide wire particles and how to use them in sheep and goats.
Reed, we had a couple of questions in the chat box. Since we're kind of talking about the deworming, how often would you recommend?
So the best strategy to protect from dewormer resistance long term is to only treat animals that are showing signs of illness. So there's a process called FAMACHA scoring, where you look at the lower eyelid. So you like cover the eye and then pull it down. You can find all this stuff online and gauge the level of anemia. So if we're targeting sheep, or if we're targeting Hymonchus, it will cause anemia. And so if we use that and we only treat animals that are showing signs of anemia and not treating the whole group, we can stop or slow parasite resistance to those dewormers. I also generally recommend, if we're doing that and we have a bit of a problem, that we use more than one product. So, and they need to be from different classes. So like Ivomec and Valbazen, those are two different classes of dewormers, and you give them a full dose of each and not treat everything. If you're an extensive system where it's really difficult to get them in the pen, then I would start looking at treating the ewes right after lambing or does right after kidding, because the females go into this period called this periparturient, they call it periparturient rise. And so their immune system slows down right when they're about to give birth, and then they start shedding a whole lot of eggs. And that's a good time to kind of kill them if we're looking at doing a calendar. But if you set up a calendar where you drench them every 45 days, it'll be about 1 year to 2 years, and that drench will no longer work. And so I know people like the simplicity of knowing, okay, do it this and this and this, but it just really doesn't, in the long term, is not a good strategy. I hope that was helpful. I'll be glad to elaborate on it if that didn't answer the question.
Okay, and her question as far as the deworming and how often was regarding haired sheep. Would you still do it the same way?
Yes.
Okay. Then the other question that was in the chat box is, can you kind of touch on vaccines?
Sure. Vaccines. The across the board suggestion for vaccines is CD&T. That's the one that we recommend everybody give. So it's Clostridium C and D, which prevents overeating, and then T is for tetanus. So if we're putting in ear tags, if we're docking tails, if we're castrating, anything that's going to create an open wound, we can prevent tetanus. C and D prevents, rapid changes in the diet and the overeating disease. That one's cheap. It's fairly effective, and we should use it. Most people say give it to pregnant animals about 6 weeks before they give birth, and then vaccinate the lambs or kids between 4 and 6 weeks, and then a follow-up booster a month later. Or you can treat those lambs and kids at a little bit younger age and give them another booster. After that, it's going to be very case specific. So, if you're in an area where anthrax is a problem, then you should vaccinate for anthrax. If you have signs of CL, so the knots under the ears and in the flanks, then you should vaccinate replacements to try to work your way out of CL problems. Sore mouth can be an issue in lambs and goats. That's a vaccine that we actually hold the license for. Unfortunately, it is a live virus. So if you don't have sore mouth and then you give this vaccine, you're introducing it into the environment. So if you have it, you should probably use it. If you don't have it, you probably shouldn't use it. Just kind of thinking offhand, other vaccines. If there's history of abortions, especially in the show world, there's a lot of abortions that run through those flocks and herds. So chlamydia, Vibrio are pretty common ones that you might have to vaccinate for. If someone has another question for a different vaccine, I'd be glad to try to answer it. But that's the majority of them.
Okay, and another question in the chat box. What about field rotations for parasites?
So it helps. The more you rotate, the more it helps. But if you study the parasite life cycle, the eggs can be deposited in the feces, and it can develop into an infected larva in as little as 4 days. And then that larva can remain viable on the pasture for in the summer when it's hot and dry like this. It's just going to be for a few days or a few weeks. But if it starts getting wet and it has moisture and it doesn't dry out, it can last as long as a month or two in the summer, and then it can last as long as 4 to 6 months in the winter. So, to really do it, you have to rotate you have to move to a new pasture every 4 days, and you can't move back into a pasture until the parasite larva has kind of died off. And that might be a month or two in the summer, and that might be 4 or 5 months in the winter. And so it's really difficult to completely avoid parasites by rotation, but it does help. Any other questions?
This is just a personal anecdote on the rotation thing. My family did French Alpine dairy goats, and you have to rotate them every 10 to 14 days before we were able to reduce worming to twice a year for only those who needed it.
Okay.
But that was in southwestern Kentucky, which is once again very humid, wet, super wet environment. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but yeah, it's you have to be very strict with it.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So you probably should have added in more about dairy goats. I know very little about dairy goats.
With dairy goats, the only other disease I would mention is CAE, the Caprine encephalitis arthritis, CEA, sorry. And there isn't a vaccine for that one. So when you get your stock, you just want to make sure that you're getting tested stock that are free of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, flock and herd biosecurity is really important. Most diseases are bought and paid for whenever we bring new animals on. And so, CAE is, also ovine progressive pneumonia would be the same media visna type disease. It's related to, anyways, I don't get into it, but yeah, it's a tough one once you get it. Foot rot is another disease that's pretty devastating, but you need it to be in warm, wet environments where there's a lot of moisture on the ground. In our area, we're too dry for that, but in other areas, it can be pretty nasty. There is a vaccine for it, but I think the California Wool Growers holds that vaccine license. So you have to kind of work with them to get it. Can't get it from the feed stores often.
Awesome. Some really great information. And I'll be the first to admit, I don't know a whole lot about sheep and goats, but I've learned quite a bit today. At this time, are there any other questions for Dr. Redden? If not, Dr. Redden, thank you for being with us today. And we will move on to our next speaker, Dr. Vanessa Cory Olsen, to visit with us about forages. Dr. Olsen, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks. Hopefully everybody can hear me and you can see my slides. So I was asked today to talk on forages for other livestock species. So I will cover sheep and goats, but I also wanted to cover horses briefly, just in case there's anyone that has multiple species, which is fairly common in parts of East Texas to have multiple species. And if there's any beef cattle questions or cattle questions, I can answer those as well. So I'm located in Overton in the East Texas. So quite a bit distance from Reed there in San Angelo. So where I'm located in East Texas, very sandy soils, high average annual rainfall. So quite a bit or a lot of forage production, and majority of the livestock in our area are cattle, beef cattle. I do think there is an increasing number of small interest in small ruminants. And then of course there's parts of our state, especially in the Denton, McKinney area, where there's quite a bit of horses as far as kind of in the East Texas area. So first and foremost, no matter what your livestock species is, some general recommendations as far as selecting forage species and varieties or plants, vegetation to grow on your property. First and foremost, we want to make sure we're selecting species and varieties that are adapted to our soil type and our climate. I could show you some maps and maybe I should have, but when we look at just the average annual rainfall, the highest average annual rainfall is in East Texas. And as we move west, that rainfall diminishes. And so as we start getting closer to San Angelo, it's much more of a droughty environment, drier, lower rainfall. A lot of major forage production is based around irrigation or forages that are adapted to more droughty conditions. And then we also have quite a variability in soil type. If you want a really pretty map with a lot of colors, a soil map of the state of Texas is just a very pretty map in regards to, you have so many different colors. There's quite a bit of variation in soil type, and our forage species and even varieties can be very site specific as far as adaptation to soil type and rainfall or lack of rainfall. So understanding your location, if you're not familiar with your property, if you're a new landowner, or if you are in the process or will be acquiring new property, the Web Soil Survey is an excellent resource. It's very easily located. You can just Google, or in your search engine on your browser of choice, you can just type in Web Soil Survey and it will be the first link that comes up. And then you can therefore put in a physical address if your property has an address. If it does not, you can put in GPS coordinates, which with all of our smartphones these days and Google Maps or Google Earth or the Maps app on your phone, you can pinpoint your location and figure out what the GPS coordinates are. And then you can put that into the Web Soil Survey and it will give you an aerial or an eagle eyes view of your property. And you can use their selection tool to determine, it will tell you your soil type, drainage. It's also an excellent tool for measuring fence lines, for measuring the size of ponds. So it's a free resource, and it's an excellent tool to use for a number of agricultural or just land management, general land management. Then something else we need to keep in mind is season of growth. Different forage species we have warm season, cool season forages. You may also want to keep in mind whether it's an annual or a perennial plant. Annuals have to be established every year. Perennials, once they're established, if they are properly managed as far as soil fertility, they're not overgrazed, we employ some weed control. Oh, hopefully, let's see. Sorry about that. My screen was doing something funky. hoping that wasn't affecting what you guys saw. So like I was mentioning, annuals, perennials, cool seasons, warm seasons, and a lot of those decisions will be based on the livestock species that you're supporting. So majority of our forage systems throughout the Southeast of the United States and even in Texas are primarily based around warm season perennial forages, warm season perennial grasses, such as Bermuda grass or Bahia grass or Old World blue stems, or even our native grasses in Texas. They are established once and then they are maintained with proper management. And warm season perennials are well adapted to our environment. Many of them can be drought tolerant. They're adapted to our higher temperatures. They're also adapted to higher rainfall environments that we see in part of the Southeast. So they are become kind of the foundation of our forage systems, no matter our livestock species. And then we incorporate other forage species, annuals, whether they're warm season or cool season, to complement that particular forage system. So other factors that will influence maybe your selection will be how you are going to use that forage, if you're going to use it primarily for grazing, or if you or intend to harvest for hay, or a combination thereof. So a lot of folks will have Bermuda grass for hay production and possibly utilize other forages for a grazing system, or Bermuda grass could be utilized for grazing and hay production. Either in the same field, we can always harvest excess forage, or we could have separate locations. And that will solely depend on your goals as a forage producer, and then your space, how many acres you have and the livestock you're trying to support. So livestock species and stage of production will be another factor that has a huge influence on the forage species that you select. So as we talk about different livestock species, they have different preferences. And you saw, even as Reed was talking about different goats and different sheep, that they even have different preferences as far as some of their forage preferences. So that will be very important. And that's the biggest challenge, especially with our small ruminants and especially goats. It's because basically the foundation of our forage systems in the Southeast is grass, or our warm season perennial grasses. Those are kind of at the bottom of the list for our goats, for a lot of our small ruminants, primarily goats. And so that is probably the biggest challenge for livestock producers in the Southeast as far as supporting goats, and just understanding that there are other preferences, browse and forb preferences for different livestock species. And then as a manager, as a land manager and a livestock manager, you also have to determine what you're willing to put in, what management practices are you willing to continue to maintain in order to support those forages, because all of them are going to require some level of inputs, whether it's fertility, lying to maintain an appropriate soil pH, weed control, planting, if it's an annual species, having to plant that every year, and that process of land preparation, what have you. So that's very important. So as you are developing a plan, there's a lot of things to think about. You also need to consider the amount of time you as a landowner are willing to put into that production system, and as opposed to other activities that might be of great interest to you. And then there may be you may have other interests for your property besides livestock, such as wildlife or hunting, or other, just personal hobbies potentially, and that may influence some of your choices. So when we look at our different livestock species, this is a chart that shows us the preferences for cattle, goats, horses, and sheep. So of course, cattle and horses, their primary preference are the grasses, whether it's warm season perennials or cool season annuals. So they consume a lot of grass. Cattle will consume some weeds. And remember, the weed by definition is a plant out of place. So that will be highly dependent on the livestock species that you're grazing. There are plants that are toxic to cattle. There are other plants that are more toxic to horses, or goats or sheep may be more sensitive to. So that will be an important component of your forage management, is being aware or knowing what plants your livestock species or multiple species could potentially be toxic to, and keep those species out of your forage systems. So goats obviously have a greater preference for browse. They're often referred to as kind of a top-down grazer. They will graze that taller vegetation, and Reed could expand on this, but that's a big challenge in areas of higher rainfall in East Texas, is our higher risk for parasite loads. And of course, those parasites are at the soil level, and so the closer to the ground goats graze, that increases their risk of internal parasites. And that's our biggest challenge in East Texas, where we have higher average annual rainfall compared to those more droughty or drier conditions. So top-down grazers, they prefer much more browse, a lot of woody species or vines, what have you, much more so than grasses like we see for cattle and horses.
Hey,
And
Vanessa,
sheep, yes.
we can, the screen, your images have not changed. We're still on the slide of choosing forage species and varieties.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know why. We'll give that a second because it's been there for, I've had it on that for a while now. I don't know if it's my internet connection. It should be stable. Is that, has it shared or switched yet?
No, ma'am.
All right, I'm gonna force see if, here, I'm gonna stop sharing and reshare. My apologies. Sometimes technology works, sometimes it does not.
Especially on Fridays.
Yes, yes. If I can find the right button. Okay, how about now?
Okay, it's on a bar graph chart?
Yes, yes.
Yes, we're good now.
All right, before you mute yourself again, I'm gonna change screens again and see if it works this time. Now you
Yes.
should see a table.
Yes.
Okay, sometimes you have to outsmart technology.
Agreed.
Yes, thank you. Just let me know if that becomes a problem again. So this is just a different variation of that same information, showing you the percent of grasses, broadleaves, and browse. So broadleaf plants would include broadleaf weeds, maybe things like goatweed, milkweed, broomweed, a lot of our broadleaf plants that we see growing in pasture systems, as well as legumes and maybe even brassicas. So legumes would include vetch, things like arrowleaf clover, crimson clover, Sericea lespedeza, soybeans, other brassicas would include things like turnips and radishes. And then browse would include things like shrubs or trees, a lot of hard or woody species, vining species that are often referred to as weeds sometimes, especially if your dominant species is meant to be a grass. So you can see there's great variation in the diet preferences. So goats as well as white-tailed deer definitely have prefer a higher concentration of browse in their diets as opposed to any things like even the broadleaf weeds or legumes and then grasses. So that's one of the biggest challenges in my opinion for us as forage producers with some of our smaller ruminants is we're so used to and we're able and very good at growing grass, but that's often not their preference. Now, sheep do prefer equally grass as well as broadleaf weeds and legumes. So it's a little bit easier than the browse or growing browse. So horses, I wanted to speak to them briefly. They are primary grass consumers, very similar to cattle. They will graze cool season forages, rye grass, small grains, and even legumes. So they fairly easy as far as creating forage systems to support horses. We do have to be mindful of toxic plants. There are often concerns about forages that are high in carbohydrates or sugars, depending if your horse is very sensitive to high sugar forages. That's a common question that I get around forages or forage selection in horses. So all of our grasses, warm season perennial grasses that we can utilize in Texas will work for horses, the old world blue stems, Bermuda grass, and Bahia grass, of course. Most horse owners have great interest in alfalfa. A lot of them buy alfalfa. I buy alfalfa hay out of Colorado or Montana. There are some producers in Texas that grow alfalfa in some very select portions of our state. And then cool season forages will work well within an equine forage system. So the warm season annuals such as forage sorghum and sorghum Sudan grass are not recommended for horses. There can be some toxicity concerns with those forage species and horses. So most equine owners have a warm season perennial system, and then they may possibly incorporate some cool season forages in the fall for winter and spring grazing if their horses are going to be on pastures quite a bit during that part of the year. But a lot of equine owners will feed their horses quite a bit. They are grazers. They're used to grazing, probably much more so than than our preference might be. A lot of people prefer to feed their horses to interact with them a lot more. So that forage system may be influenced by your preference as well as your space, your area. Also for horses, based on their stage of production will influence their nutrient needs. Reed showed you very early on some nutrient requirements for sheep and goats. So all of our livestock, their nutrient requirements will depend on their level of production. Whether your horses are primarily, spending time on pasture, they're not highly active, they're not being worked or exercised. If they're very mature, they're not growing, they're not producing foals. Obviously, their requirements are a little lower. And so our traditional warm season perennial grasses can often meet their needs. So as any livestock species become more productive, require higher nutrient inputs, typically higher protein, higher digestibility. That's when we need to become more selective with our forage species and possibly incorporate some different forage species. And depending on the time of year when they are the most productive, well, it can also influence the forage species we're selecting. So if we have young animals that are actively growing, especially in the springtime, that would be a great opportunity to utilize some cool season forages such as annual rye grass or legumes that are primarily spring forage producers. They are higher in nutritive value compared to our warm season perennials. Legumes, of course, are the highest quality forage that we can grow in Texas for livestock or anywhere in the US for that matter. High in protein, high in digestibility, and typically very high in palatability. One of the biggest challenges, especially with horses, is grazing management. So that will be the fewer acres you will have to work harder at managing their grazing. And because horses have upper front teeth and lower front teeth, they could graze much closer to the soil surface compared to cattle or some of our other livestock species. They can graze so close to the soil surface that they will continue to graze very close to the soil surface as that new growth, especially on our warm season perennials such as Bermuda grass and Bahia grass, that new growth always generates from that crown. So that's kind of that soil surface level. And that new young growth is always higher in nutritive value than more mature vegetation. And they will typically always select for that higher quality, younger, less mature forage and avoid that higher, more mature, lower quality forage. And this is an excellent picture where you can see lawns where those horses, as you can see in the background, have continually grazed down that warm season perennial or that forage and kept it very short. And then you have the roughs, areas that they have avoided. It may be because of manure that has built up in some locations, or maybe it's a fire ant hill. It's very common in Texas. But for whatever reason, they've avoided those areas. And as that forage matures, they don't go back and graze it. So grazing management can become very important. You may need to go in and mow some of those roughs to initiate new growth. Reed was talking about rotation, pasture rotation, especially in response to trying to reduce parasite load or control parasite populations. We use the same tool to reduce selective grazing, to force our livestock to use all aspects of a pasture and to reduce some of this repetitive grazing that leads to this lawn versus rough environment. Obviously, forages that are overgrazed, that are grazed that closely to the soil surface and continue to graze are it's going to be harder for those plants to recover from drought. They're slower to recover from those overgrazing events as it is. It also opens up the canopy and increases the opportunity for weed seeds to germinate and for weeds to become a problem on your property. And it can also lead to soil erosion, which can be dangerous for livestock and then detrimental potentially to our environment, as manure or fertilizer could possibly move off into non-target areas such as creeks or ponds. So for horses, grazing management, in my opinion, is probably the biggest challenge, not necessarily forage selection or any of that process, but grazing management is the biggest challenge. So for equine owners, because a lot of equine owners have fewer acres and often more horses than their acreage will actually support. If you've driven through anywhere in Texas, I'm sure many of us have driven by areas where farmers or ranchers or people have, several horses on very small property, and they're basically having to feed them because they've overgrazed any pasture that was possibly ever there. And so that increases the need for feed. And that creates a lot of other challenges as well. So typically recommend 2 to 3 acres per horse, and that is going to be in a good growing condition environment. So we have good moisture. So we may need to increase that number of acres during drought years like we have now, like we're currently in, or if anything else is going to reduce forage production, such as some of your management practices. Maybe if you're not fertilizing because of high fertilizer prices, you will need to adjust that stocking rate to allow for the fact that you're not going to have as much forage production to meet the needs of those animals. So you may need to increase the number of acres you have per horse during a drought year or during a scenario where management is shifted because of economics. So avoid grazing until plants have reached an average height of about 6 to 8 inches. So once they've grazed that forage down to about 3 to 4 inches, you need to move those animals. If you still have some rough areas, that would be great. You could go in and you could mow those roughs and promote the initiation of new growth from the crown of those plants. If they are avoiding areas like manure, I would think about going in and dragging out that manure, spreading it across the pasture to allow for recycling of those nutrients. And that could possibly help with the degradation of those manure piles. That could possibly help with maybe any potential parasite risk. But that would be a great question for your veterinarian possibly, but it'll also spread those nutrients and allow for faster degradation of that manure and reincorporation of those nutrients into that pasture system. So this is just another visualization of what occurs when we overgraze our forage systems, no matter what our livestock species is, whether it's horses. I use the same slide with cattle producers. Any of our grazing species have the ability to overgraze our forage systems if we allow them to. If we do not implement some strategies such as rotational grazing or decrease our stocking rate, reduce the number of animals we have per acre in a given location for a period of time. So under grazing, as that plant tries to regrow from that grazing event, it has to pull from the root structure in order to produce new leaves. So as it does that, part of that root structure dies back. It's pulling the carbohydrates from that storage and then trying to produce new leaves so it can continue to photosynthesize and not only produce new roots, but also produce more and new top growth. So unfortunately, like we saw in that lawns and rough area, if we continue to graze that lawn area, they continue to nibble on any new growth that tries to come up, more of that root structure is going to die back. And those very shallow rooted forages are not going to survive drought. They're not going to be competitive against weeds that might try to pop up. So they really diminish the grazable area and increase a lot of other problems, or it leads to a lot of additional issues within our forage systems. So whether we implement something such as rotational grazing or we reduce our stocking rate, we need to allow those plants to rest, to kind of recover from that grazing event so they can regrow their root structure as well as top growth. So that's why the recommendation for horses is to not graze those pastures until you have 6 to 8 inches of forage for them to actually utilize. And the same can be said for cattle. they can very easily overgraze a forage system as well. So grazing management is going to be key for any of our livestock species in order to maintain an appropriate or an adequate forage system for that species. So this is a good example of an overgrazed pasture. You can see a lot of manure out there because there's really very little forage, very little forage growth in that pasture system. So moving on to some of our other livestock species, sheep, a small ruminant. I do see some in parts of East Texas. I was actually on the road this morning traveling down to Franklin, the central part of the state, and I passed a couple of pastures of sheep. In regards to their forage preferences, they will graze grass as well as broadleaf weeds and forbs, much more so than goats will. Goats prefer browse. So there are a lot of forage species that we can utilize. And as I talk about goats, a lot of the forage species, the grasses and the broadleaf and the legumes, sheep will often utilize those much more so than goats actually will. So we'll get to that here shortly. So goats, like I mentioned, are primarily top-down grazers. They prefer browse. Grass is kind of the last of their preference within our forage systems. So this is just the NRC. This is an old NRC, so Reed can tell me, I'm sure there's an updated as far as nutrient requirements for goats. NRC would also have one for sheep. And Reed did mention some great resources to answer additional questions you might have on sheep or goat production and those various sheep or goat systems. So some of the forage species that I would recommend, especially for sheep, as well as could be the basis or the foundation for even some of our goat systems. Our warm season perennials, depending on your location in the state, your warm season base may be Bermuda grass or Old World blue stems. That will depend on your soil type and then your average annual rainfall as what warm season perennial might be best suited for your property. But most of our forage systems in Central and East Texas do tend to start with Bermuda grass and or Bahia grass. There is some use of things like Old World blue stems or native grasses. They can be used for grazing or for grazing livestock. I do not recommend cline grass for sheep, goats, or horses. So cline grass would only be recommended for cattle. If you've ever heard of someone mention cline grass as a warm season perennial grass that can grow in the central part of our state. For sheep, we can incorporate, and cattle, as well as horses, we can incorporate some cool season annual grasses, such as annual rye grass, any of our small grains. Keep in mind that any of our annual species are always going to be higher in nutritive value than our perennials. So even though the basis or the foundation of most of our forage systems in the Southeast are warm season perennial grasses, of a lot of our forage species, they're not as high in quality as any of our annual warm season annuals, such as crabgrass or our sorghums or pearl millet. They're going to be in lower quality. They're lower in nutritive value compared to those warm season annuals. And they're definitely lower in nutritive value than our cool season forages. So anything that we can grow that we would plant in the fall and would grow during the winter and spring, such as ryegrass or legumes, are better suited are going to be higher in nutritive value. So those annuals will work great for sheep, and they will work better for goats compared to our warm season perennial grasses, primarily because of their higher nutritive value. Now, that may not be their preference. Goats they still do not prefer the broadleaf plants or the clovers over the browse. So browse should be their primary diet if possible. There are some legumes that are high in tannins that a lot of sheep and goat producers are interested in, such as Sericea lespedeza. Sericea lespedeza has a high tannin content that adds some anti-parasite characteristics to that vegetation. Annual lespedezas do have some tannin levels, but not nearly as high as Sericea lespedeza. I will tell you, depending on where you're located in the state, if you are closer to the Oklahoma border, I will warn you that in Oklahoma, they consider Lespedeza to be an invasive weed. It has become problematic, very invasive in their grasslands as well as in cropping systems. And so they consider it an invasive species. And Lespedeza is utilized quite a bit throughout the Southeast, the United States, and places like Alabama, Georgia, for small ruminant forage production, and even for cattle. Cattle will also graze the Lespedezas, and they are a legume. They are a warm season species, but I see some utilization of Lespedezas in Texas, but not very much. But just that could be an option potentially, but just keep in mind the closer you are to Oklahoma, there can be some great concerns with invasiveness of that particular species. So browse and forbs, that's going to include a lot of vegetation that many, especially cattle producers and maybe equine producers, would consider to be weeds. So small trees, brush, often referred to as brush species, greenbrier, persimmons. See a lot of persimmons in East Texas, in my area, as well as McCartney rose. We do have McCartney rose in parts of East Texas and other areas of the state. You may have heard of it referred to as hedge rose. It was introduced into the United States as a purpose for use as a hedge or a barrier, property barrier, but it has become somewhat invasive and is actually considered an invasive species. But from other producers, especially goat producers, I've been told that goats love McCartney rose. And I have some pictures I'll show you here shortly, that they will decimate it. They will overgraze it to the point of removing that population from your property, which could be a pro and a con, especially if you're trying to maintain a goat herd. A lot of other vegetation such as kudzu, honeysuckle, pigweeds. There are some there's some native species such as Illinois bundleflower that is considered a browse or a forb. Things like turnips, radishes could also potentially be an option for goats as well as for sheep. So this is a picture of this is actually Yopon holly. I put in the wrong picture. My apologies. I thought I'd use my McCartney rose picture. So I do not have a picture of McCartney rose. My apologies. I used the wrong slide. Persimmons, very common in East Texas. They do become large trees. This is actually a pasture in East Texas. Those are all in between that Bermuda grass. You can see some persimmon sprouts. These are highly preferred by goats. So it's an option. So most likely you'll use a mixture of forages, depending on your location in the state and the livestock species that you're growing. Like I said, most of our forage systems start with a warm season perennial grass, and then you could incorporate some cool season forages, especially for cattle, horses, as well as sheep, such as rye grass or the clovers. Like I said, once again, goats, the grasses and even the forbs are going to be lower on their preference as opposed to browse. So providing a lot of browse, a lot of the things like honeysuckle or persimmons or mimosas, McCartney rose, other woody species is going to be preferred for goats. You could also, as another option, maybe in a separate pasture or a completely different forage system, would be an annual rotation where you're utilizing winter annuals as well as summer annual forages to meet the needs of your livestock. But that does require more inputs because you are looking at establishing every season. So starting with a well-prepared seed bed and then planting those seeds for those various species. Some can be planted in combination with each other, such as annual ryegrass and the small grains could be both planted as a cool season mixture. And then the following season, you could come in with some crabgrass or some brassicas, such as turnips or radishes potentially, to graze during that summer season. So these are some pictures of, this is Lespedeza, Lab, which is a warm season annual legume that we can grow in Texas. It's well adapted to sandy clay loam soils, so it will grow well in East Texas. It is a warm season annual legume. It's highly palatable. Unfortunately, it's easily overgrazed. So for many of our annual species, that will require some grazing management to have regrowth or to allow for regrowth of those forages. So they're not only available for a short window or short period of time. So that is a warm season annual legume that can be utilized for livestock as a high quality forage. Cowpeas, despite the name of cowpeas, cows do not necessarily really like or really find cowpeas very palatable, but sheep and or goats could possibly utilize cowpeas. They are warm season annual. Deer really like cowpeas, white-tailed deer. So if you're trying to attract wildlife to your property, that can be an excellent option. Cowpeas are adapted to a variety of soil type. They would definitely require some grazing management to prevent overgrazing or to allow for regrowth. So you would need to allow them to put on substantial growth before you would graze those forages, and then you could limit graze or only allow them so much access or to portions of the pasture as opposed to giving them full access, because they're easily overgrazed very quickly. The Lespedezas, I mentioned Sericea is a perennial. There are also annual Lespedezas. Sericea lespedeza has the higher tannin content. Once again, I did mention that it is considered an invasive species in Oklahoma. It is very drought tolerant. It will tolerate acidic soils if you have very sandy soils that are low in soil pH. And it does have some anti-parasitic capabilities. So a lot of people are interested in Lespedezas, especially for our small ruminants. Bundle flower is actually native to Texas. Depending on your location in the property, in the state, there's some different recommendations for bundle flower. It is not well adapted to acidic soils. So if you are along I-35 or have some blackland clays, some heavier clay soils that tend to have a higher soil pH, bundle flower will do very well in those areas. And bundle flower actually contains some tannin as well. So that could potentially serve as anti-parasitic as well. Our cool season forages, our small grains are typically recommended by our small ruminants much more so than annual ryegrass. And then based on some research at Uvalde, they had 90 days of grazing ryegrass with 10-month-old doe kids, and they had an average daily gain of 1/10 of a pound a day. And that was, of course, in Uvalde, that was under irrigation. So ryegrass, most of our ryegrass production is east of I-35, where we do have higher average annual rainfall. Oats are not very cold tolerant, so we don't see a lot of oat production much north of I-20. So we see more oats in central and further south, and wheat is very cold tolerant, so it would do well along I-20 or north of I-20 for us in Texas. Austrian Winter Pea. I frequently get questions about Austrian Winter Pea. It is a cool season forage. It's not very cold hardy, so depending on your location in the state, may not necessarily be an excellent option. It does not tolerate overgrazing. It would easily be overgrazed. So that can be a challenge within a grazing system. So it would require some strict management to allow for regrowth and to extend the grazing season for that particular forage species. Turnips. Turnips for grazing, they can be used in the fall and the spring if they are managed correctly. There are forage type turnips versus, say, purple top turnips or turnips that you might grow for human consumption. Forage type turnips are going to have more or greater leaf production, obviously more forage production, and then they will regrow following a grazing event much more readily than the vegetable crop turnips. So animals often have to be forced to consume them at first. They kind of have to acquire the taste on the turnips, but the same thing can occur with our legumes. Even with cattle, often we have to, they will a lot of times try to graze everything else before they'll start grazing the legumes. And it's just, like most of us, we have to often acquire a taste for something. But once they kind of start grazing it, it's no longer necessarily a problem. So there just might be kind of a transition period. Turnips are not legumes, so they're not going to fix nitrogen. They have quite quite a recommendation. Need high levels of nitrogen for that leaf growth production. They're very high in protein and high in digestibility, and in regards to just the forage production. And so oftentimes they may pull up the bulbs and eat those as well. I'm not aware of any concerns with sheep or goats with consuming those bulbs. Cattle can consume them as well. There can be some concerns with choking hazard potentially, depending on the size of those bulbs. And those bulbs are very high in carbohydrates, so there's not going to be a lot of fiber in the actual radish or the turnip portion of that plant or that vegetation. So I realized that was a lot of information very quickly. I do have a forage website, foragefacts.tamu.edu. You can locate my contact information. I'm always happy to answer any forage questions that you might have. And there are some excellent resources on the Forage Facts website. Unfortunately, I do not, as of yet, have a publication on forages for small ruminants. Hope to have one of those one day soon. But with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Vanessa. If you've got any questions for Vanessa, please feel free to either unmute yourself or put them in the chat box.
Is there anything we can do to make greenbrier even more appealing to goats?
Even more appealing?
We have a lot of greenbrier.
Oh, okay. Well, you just may need a few more goats.
Yeah, we need a few more goats.
Right.
We have longhorns on our place, and the longhorns do a fairly good job with everything but the greenbrier.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Yeah.
The unfortunate thing with greenbrier is it usually has such a large taproot that until you really exhaust that root structure from kind of overgrazing, it's going to keep coming back, or you're going to keep having regrowth. But you know, in my opinion, goats are a great way to try to manage greenbrier, much easier than the amount and the number of herbicide applications that it actually takes. And then goats are also safer than spraying herbicide under trees, because a lot of times we have greenbrier growing on trees or along fence lines very often.
Thank you.
You're welcome. There was a question about, is Milo hay an okay feed for sheep? That might be a better question for Reed. I'm not aware of any concerns. Myself or the agent could easily visit with Reed or send him an email, or you're welcome to contact him and see if he has any recommendations one way or the other. But that I do not have a confident answer in that question. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm still here. I think it would kind of depend on on what the Milo hay is. If it's like they've harvested a sorghum crop already, and then you have some regrowth, and then they come back and make hay out of it. There may be a lot of stems that could be in there, and so depending on what the stem to kind of leaf ratio, what the digestibility of it would be, grazing some of that regrowth, especially after a period of dry time, might be a little bit of a concern, given some prussic acid levels that could be in there. But most of that would probably be diminished when you made hay out of it. So my simplistic approach to hay is, unless it's moldy and nasty, put it out there, and if they eat it and they look like they're doing well on it, then get more of it.
All right. Oh, I have posted a link to a short survey in the chat box. If you would take a few minutes to complete this survey, this helps us with AgriLife tremendously in terms of being able to continue to bring quality programs to the public and based on information that y'all are needing. So if you would take a few minutes to fill that out, it'd be greatly appreciated. If there are no other questions at this time, we will go ahead and conclude the meeting and let everybody have a wonderful Friday afternoon coming into the weekend. Reed, Vanessa, as always, thank you very much for agreeing to be the speakers for one of these programs. Your knowledge is always greatly appreciated. So with that being said, everybody have a great weekend.